Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our weekly Bible study. Trust you're enjoying the beautiful fall weather. Things are, not quite as warm and hot and muggy, but enjoying the cool weather. Great sleeping weather. Now, my wife is not enjoying it. If it's less than 80 degrees, she's freezing. And so I told her that maybe this week she ought to get out her winter jacket because she might need it because it's only going to get up to 78 this week and not 88. And so anyway, isn't it? It's always fun as we go through these seasons that we experience. Well, we've been talking about what happens after the children of Israel had been in captivity for 70 years. And so we've been looking at what's taking place. And um, we looked at last week the fact that, remember, most of the Jews who returned from the exile under the leadership of Zerubbabel, uh, most of the Jews did not return with Zerubbabel, only about 50,000. And there were literally tens of thousands more Jews that stayed in the diaspora. Now, diaspora is a technical term. It means scattering. It's when culture or people group are removed from their homeland. And so the Jews had experienced initially a diaspora under the Assyrians when they came into the northern kingdom and destroyed Samaria and the northern kingdom and dispersed them throughout their empire. One of the interesting things about that diaspora was that those people lost their identity because they got scattered throughout the Assyrian Empire. Over time, the generations mingled with the people that they were living around and lost their culture. Whereas when the southern kingdom went into captivity in 606 BC under Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar took Daniel and his three friends. They began that 70 years of captivity. When they went in kind of as a group, and they were able to pretty much keep their identity in check. So much so that during that period of the exile, they established things like the synagogue, which kept the culture alive, kept the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, all of these people that had a huge impact in the life of the nation and what the nation had gone through the centuries. All of that was kept alive in the synagogue. Even the language was kept alive. But at the end, after the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians under Cyrus the king, he gave a decree for the Jews, excuse me, the Hebrews to return back to Jerusalem. But as I said, many did not. They did not take advantage of that permission to return home from exile. Why? That becomes an interesting study. Real simple, they were not slaves when they had gone into exile in the Babylonians. Yes, they were a conquered people, um, but they were like just in probably any other immigrant group. They came in, and over time, they started businesses. They were workers that worked for people. And in fact, many of them became leaders in the kingdom, influencing maybe the captors over time. We think of Daniel. Daniel was a wise man. He was an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar and then later on to Cyrus within Persia. So here he was, a Jew who had a very prominent position. But we have other people like Mordecai. We're going to look at Mordecai today, who had a position of authority within the kingdom of Persia. Ezra, we'll be looking at him probably next week. He had a position of leadership. And of course, we know about Nehemiah, the food taster or the cupbearer for the king of Persia. These are Jews having a prominent place. They're not slaves. They had official roles within these kingdoms. And so the people prospered even while they were away from their homeland. And in fact, when they had the opportunity, Daniel did not return. Mordecai and his family did not return, and many others did not return. Ezra's family did not return initially, and Nehemiah's family did not return. All of these people stayed in diaspora. It's not an exile. Exile is officially over. It was terminated with Cyrus' decree, but they're living still outside of their homeland. And so that's how the word diaspora is used, diaspora, the scattering of the people. It's now 30 years. Remember, the original reason why Cyrus gave the decree for the Hebrews or Jews to return to Jerusalem was to rebuild the temple. And we, over the last couple of weeks, talked about the local people, giving them all kinds of opposition and pushback, sending letters to the king, challenging them to stop building. And at one point, they were given a letter to stop building because the locals had accused them of rebuilding the city of conflict and rebellion against their captors. And it was true. Jerusalem had been a city of rebellion, particularly under the Babylonians. But what they had failed to give in the initial correspondence with the king of Persia was the fact that it was king himself, Persia, who had decreed this. But that got lost because we now have a subsequent king of Persia in place. Cyrus has passed away. And so the people of Jerusalem have to appeal to now the new king, Darius, and say, listen, we were authorized by the law of the Medes and the Persian under Cyrus to rebuild our place of worship. And when they went through the records that were in Babylon, because that's where Cyrus was when he issued the decree, when they went through the archives, they found the correspondence that had declared that the Jews could return to rebuild their temple. So the temple is finally built. It gets built in 516 BC. Now, just to give context for those who like history, Jerusalem was destroyed in 586, 70 years earlier. It was destroyed. Daniel and his friends went into captivity under the Babylonians in 606. So that gives us some time has passed now. So it's been 100 years after the destruction of Solomon's temple, 120 years after Daniel and his friends were taken to Babylon, and about 50 years after Daniel dies. We don't know exactly, but we have a little window there where he died shortly after Persia conquers Babylon, and Daniel is thrown in the lion's den. He probably just lives another year or so after the lion's den experience. So now this is where we come to the events of today. And we're going to talk about not what's happening in Jerusalem, but what's happening within the Persian Empire. Because remember, we have all these people who did not return to Jerusalem. We'll come back and revisit that part of the story next week. But today we're going to look at what was happening in Persia, in the capital of Susa, during this period. And so we now come to 483 BC, okay, about 30 years after the temple is completed. Xerxes is now the leader of the Persians, and he wants to do what his father Darius couldn't accomplish, and that was to control the Greeks. As Darius is expanding his empire, and under Darius, the Persian Empire probably reaches its zenith in terms of land that they controlled. And so they wanted to go even further west against the Greeks. And they kept going in on several campaigns. And while they do things like at one point burn down Athens, they are unable to maintain control, and the Greeks keep pushing them out. Now, we may go into that after we finish this of what happens, because the Greeks never forget what the Persians have done. And that's when Alexander the Great, when he comes to power, he goes after the Persians with a vengeance. But we digress here. Let's go back to the story. So Xerxes wants to accomplish what his father couldn't, and that was to control the Greeks. So what does he do? Well, he can't just arbitrarily raise an army, because the way the empire was set up, they had 127 regional leaders, and each of them had control over monetary things. Yes, they probably paid taxes to the capital and to the king, but they had tremendous influence. They're the ones that could raise an army from their province and fund that army. Well, Darius, the dad, had tried this several times and to no avail. And there wasn't a great enthusiasm on the part of the Persian satraps to do this. So he throws a 180-day expo, showing off his vast wealth and power in order to inspire the Persian leadership that possibly now's the time that we can do this and we can control the Greeks. He promises great rewards to those who will help him retake Athens. And it proved quite successful, because he wants to show them that he can do what his father couldn't do. At the end of the 180 days of pomp and ceremony, he throws a 7-day party. Now, this is open to the public, so this is not just the nobility or just not the leadership of the empire, but this is open to everyone in the city. And the Persians were famous for their luxurious gardens. These were large parks throughout the city with trees and wild animals that actually, many of them, obviously not lions, but many of them, like peacocks and other animals, they were allowed to wander throughout the park, and beautiful fountains. There was probably a parade of captured slaves, signs of wealth and military prowess, music, dancing, and lots of drinking. Lots of drinking. No limitation, no restraint, kind of open bar. And after 7 days of this partying, everyone is drunk, including the king, Xerxes. Hey, when the Bible says that wine makes us foolish, this is a perfect illustration of what happens when alcohol gets in our system. This is crazy what Xerxes is about ready to do. So it's at the end, day 7 of the party. They're drunk. They probably can't talk straight. And he sends his eunuchs. Now, he didn't send one to invite his wife Vashti to come to the party. He sends 7 eunuchs. Why? Because they're going to carry her in. This is going to be just another parading of the, in this case, elegance of the kingdom. In other words, he's asking his wife to be a spectacle. The Hebrew rabbis say that more than likely she was to come in without any clothes on. She was nude. Okay. And so you got a bunch of drunk guys, and this beautiful wife comes in. Now, we know that Vashti was the daughter of the king Belshazzar's of Babylon. So she would be the great granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. You've heard the phrase trophy wife. Well, this is a trophy wife. He wants to parade his trophy wife before them because it shows, one, her beauty, but two, the splendor of the fact that the Persians had conquered the mighty Babylonians. But he didn't know what his wife was all about, because while she was beautiful, she was also strong-willed and a determined woman. So she refuses. She will not appear before men who are drunk and be insulted, humiliated, or objectified. Okay. as we would say, way to go, girl. Hey, because it's ridiculous. Bunch of drunk guys thinking this is a great idea. It's interesting. Think about our own lives. Sometimes some of our great ideas only make sense from our point of view. And do we ever think about, is this a great idea for someone else? I teach high school, and one of the fun things about teaching high school is that they're still trying to figure themselves out a little bit. And so some of them think that it's great to pick on somebody or to say something that's funny but demeaning at the same time. And you stop there and thinking, if everyone can't laugh, then is it really a good joke? In other words, if we're picking on someone, belittling someone, using them to tell a joke and to get people to laugh, but the person who's the brunt of the joke is not laughing, it's not a good joke. It's a horrible joke. And so we constantly have to remind them, listen, would you like it if you were the brunt of the jokes? Okay. And of course, some people get it, some people don't. Well, here's Xerxes. Just crazy, crazy. Well, he becomes furious. Why? Because he was shamed by his wife. He's embarrassed. And he's so totally self-absorbed. Okay. He becomes enraged and he seeks counsel. From who? People that were sober, that would give him wise counsel? No. He sought it from those who are also drunk. And they're all not sure what to do. They realize that they have a problem here because if Vashti does this to the king, they're concerned that their wives are going to do it to them and say no to them. And we can't let her get away with this. And so he should have probably just ignored it. Yeah, there would have been a little pushback and embarrassment. But what he does next becomes really ridiculous. He makes the situation worse. A couple things here. Be careful who you go to seek counsel from. I tell my students, seek counsel from people who have lots of experience, and that's probably not your peers. Okay? So if you're wanting to seek counsel about marriage, go find someone who's been married a long time, not been married 4 times. Okay? Someone who's hung in there through the thick and thin of relationships. Okay? So be careful who we ask advice from. And second, think through the next step. Is this going to actually help the situation, or is this going to make it worse? Well, what does Xerxes do? He issues an edict called the Law of the Medes and Persians, which basically says that once this edict is given, it can't be taken back. It can't be rescinded. And the edict was that men are in charge and must be in control. Now, I have a note here that I think is spot on, and it's not original to me, but I believe it's true. If you have to say, I'm in charge, then you are not in charge. Okay? If I'm having to pound my chest and pound on the table and indicate I'm in charge, then you probably are not in charge. Oh, you may have the role, you may have the position, but if no one's following you, that's really the sign of who's in charge. And so people can be in a role of leadership, but if no one's following them, they're not in charge. And they can pound their chest and they can do lots of things, but that doesn't insist that they're in charge because people don't respect them. People have lost. And that's what Xerxes did here. What he did was shameful. What he did was he disrespected another human being, one of God's creations. And so now he's going to go around and says, hey, I'm king. Well, we already know you're king. But if you got to do an edict to declare that men are in charge, men were in a bad situation. Okay? Because is it about who's in charge, who's not in charge? It's about respect. It's about relationships. And so demanding respect misses the point because respect is earned. If you're in position of authority and leadership, your position, people follow you because they respect your leadership. But when I have to demand it, then I have to use other means by force or whatever to intimidate people to actually follow me. Okay. So after the big party, okay, Vashti is banished, but he doesn't get married right away because his party, his expo, 108 expo, was successful. And so he goes and he's now raised an army. He's still single, okay, got rid of his wife, and he goes off for 4 years and attacks the Greeks. But he loses again, just like his father. They're able to hold off. It's not that the Greeks don't are not bloodied and there's not land that's conquered, but the Greeks are able basically to push the Persians back, primarily because of their ships. There were several battles that we can think of that the Persians had against the Greeks. There's the Battle of Marathon that happened under Darius. Okay, Xerxes here, he loses the battle because his navy is defeated by the Greek navy. And when he gets home, he's despondent. He's despondent because he went and thought he would be successful, unlike his dad, in defeating the Greeks. But two, he realizes that he lost something when he got rid of his wife, Vashti, that he made a major mistake. And so his advisors, who probably are now sober, are saying, listen, you need to get a new wife. And that brings us to the story that we're familiar with from the book of Esther. So beautiful virgins are identified, okay, and brought, and the word there actually means taken. They're not going freely to Susa. In other words, there are the representatives of the king that go around and find the most beautiful virgins in the land. Josephus says there was about 400 of them, and they're brought to Susa and they're placed into a harem because they are to be prepped for 1 year before they meet the king and he decides who's going to be Vashti's replacement. So, one thing we've got, and Esther's going to be in the story, right? She's one of these beautiful virgins. Okay. She doesn't, this is not something she willingly does. This is something she has to do. So she's going to make the best of a bad situation. While they're there, they're placed under the care of a eunuch in the king's palace where she finds favor. She's not obnoxious. She's not difficult. But for whatever reason, she connects with the eunuch who kind of takes her under his wing and kind of helps her through. Now, we know her as Esther. Hadassah is actually her Hebrew name. Okay. And so she's one of these virgins that is tutored by the king's eunuch. Now, one of the interesting things about this, because remember, we're talking about the Hebrews or Jews that are in the diaspora. Okay. She hides her nationality. It's a very common thing for Jews in many parts of the world. When they go in, they will hide their identity. In fact, if you go back and look at in the early part of the 20th century, many Jews went to Hollywood or became part of radio and everything else, but they changed their names so people didn't know they were Jewish. Okay, hide their family background. So this is not a rare situation. This actually was very, very common about the Jews when they were in different lands. Okay, a friend of mine who worked at Phillips, we were on a business trip and she told me about her family background. We were sharing each other's background. Mine from an American Indian and hers found out she was Jewish, but she didn't find out till she was 20 years old that she was Jewish, that her parents had kept this from her, but also the grandparents had kept it from the kids for a long time because of World War II. In other words, in order to hide from the Nazis, they all, quote, converted to Catholicism or Lutheran, wherever they were at in the empire. And so a whole generation was raised not knowing their Jewish heritage until much later in life. So Esther hides her nationality when she's she goes into the king's harem. Okay. And this was per the instruction of her adopted dad. Actually, Mordecai is her cousin. But when Esther's parents die, he adopts Esther as his daughter. He becomes the patriarch of, of Esther. Now, I'm going to put one other note here because it's going to come back into the story here in just a few minutes. Mordecai is a descendant of King Saul. King Saul. So the family comes from nobility, okay, at least many years earlier, and again, as descendants of Saul. Well, back to Esther. After a year of preparation, which involved, scripture tells us, bathing in ointments, beauty compounds, exercise, dieting, they are paraded. Now, this is part of the story that we just say, hey, it was a beauty contest, and we can tell our 5 and 6 year old grandkids about the story, but that's not really what happened here. Um, and so she goes into Xerxes' chamber, spends the evening, and then is sent back to the harem because he's basically going through the women trying to see who he wants as his wife. And so they're sitting there, now part of the harem, with great expectations. Is he going to choose me? Is he not going to choose me? Because they realize for many of these girls, depending on where they came from, that while this was not an ideal situation, it probably was better from where they came from in terms of they had good food, they had nice clothes, they had a roof over their head. So even if they never made it out of the harem, in some respects, and I don't mean to create a romantic type situation here, or that it was ideal, but it was probably better in some respects than where they came from, where maybe food was scarce or maybe they were being persecuted. So she goes back and she waits because they're all trying to decide who is going to be selected. Now, let's just pause here. During that year of preparation, Mordecai, who is part of the the we'll say the government. Yeah, that's probably the best way to put it. The government of the king, he works for him. He's not a high position. He's not like Daniel. He's got a lower position, but he uncovers a plot against Xerxes by some of his guards. And so he actually reveals the plot, and the ones that were conspiring to do harm to the king are killed. Okay. And Xerxes' name is placed in the records of the king. That was one of the things scribes did back then. They always basically wrote a diary of what's taking place. And we can go back. This is mentioned, by the way, the Israel kings did this too. So when it talks about, and all of the things that this king did is in the chronicles of the king. Okay, it says diary. They would keep a diary of every king. Well, this is what's happening here. And so his name and what he had done is placed in the records, but he's never honored for this heroic deed. Okay, it kind of gets lost in all the other activities going on. The adversary of Mordecai is the chief minister, a much higher person in the government by the name of Haman, who's very insecure, but very ambitious. He's also very anti-Semitic. Now, here's where the twist to the story really becomes interesting. He is a descendant of King Agag. Okay, now who was King Agag? Well, King Agag was the king that King Saul was supposed to kill under the direction of Samuel, and he refused to kill him. And in fact, he disobeyed Saul, and he allowed much of the sheep to be kept, supposedly as sacrifices, but he was supposed to have nothing to do with this king. And the king managed to survive because Saul was disobedient to what God and Samuel had told him. And I imagine because of what Saul had done, this king raised his kids, who raised their kids, who raised their kids to hate the Hebrews Jews. So by the time we get to Haman, generations removed, there is this family history of hatred of the Jews. And so he's very anti-Semitic. And when he finds out, okay, that Mordecai is a Jew, he's furious. Now, how does he find out? Well, Haman liked to go through the city and basically act like he was someone important. Well, you deferred to those that were in positions of authority by bowing to them. And Mordecai said, I'm not bowing to this guy. And so whenever Haman would come to the city, Mordecai would just stand there like a statue. And this happened time after time after time. And Haman is getting furious, finds out that he's a Jew. Oh my goodness. Now his frustration turns to hatred, and now he plots to exterminate the Jews. He convinces the king by issuing a decree for the king to issue a decree that all the Jews from 1 year from the date of the decree would be eliminated. And what was the reason that Haman gave that the king bought into? That these people are disloyal to you and don't obey the laws of the land. I don't know, maybe the king was kind of down that day. We do know the king actually really liked Haman. In other words, he held him in high respect and everything else. So probably a number of things are going on here, but he agrees to this. Now, he does not know at this point that his wife, well, the wife to be, because this is the year of preparation, he does not know that his wife to be is a Jew, okay, which comes into the story. So this decree is given a year. And you say, well, why was it pushed out a year? Well, it's going to take a while for it to get to throughout the empire, because wherever their Jews are, basically it's an open season to hunt down the local Jew and kill them. I mean, true anti-Semitism at its worst. Now, when Mordecai receives word about this edict, he immediately goes into mourning. He tears his clothes and he's wailing through the city. Okay. Now, Esther is oblivious to what's going on. So she must have just become the queen after this, all of, because this takes some time for it to play out. And so Esther now, she's moved from the harem because of the event that took place with Mordecai and Haman that happened months earlier. She's now the queen, and this edict is finally released. He goes and he's mourning. The servants girls to Esther go and tell her, there's this person out there that's wailing, that's calling out your name. And so Esther goes and confronts her adopted dad and says, Dad, what are you doing? You're embarrassing me. You're an embarrassment. And Mordecai says, you don't know the story, do you? And she goes, what story? And then he tells her what her husband had just declared, that within a matter of months, all Jews would be killed. Well, she doesn't want to do it. First of all, she doesn't know what to do. And then when he says, you got to go and appeal to the king, she doesn't know what to do. She's scared. She says, if I'm not invited into his presence, I could get killed. And Mordecai issues these tremendous words that most of us know who've grown up in the church, where Mordecai says to Esther, is it possible that you have been placed in the position you're in for such a time as this? basically to save her people. Esther says, okay, Dad, I'll do it. I'll do it. And so she goes before the king. Now, when she goes before the king, who does receive her, she invites him to a party because I personally don't think Esther knew exactly how to approach this. She just knew she needed to do something. So she throws a party and she says to the king, hey, why don't you invite that close associate that's in the kingdom, Haman, to the party? And so she invites him to the party. Have a great party. At the end of the party, after the king's probably had a few too many to drink, he goes, hey, listen, why did you throw this party? And I'll give you half, whatever you want. Okay. Kind of lost it there. Again, I don't know that she's ready to broach the subject. And so she invites them to another banquet the next evening. So that night, the first night, Haman goes home and he's ecstatic because he's just been wined and dined by the king and queen. And he's going to get invited to come back again. And he just feels like, wow, things have never been so good. Well, while he's doing this, he's preparing the scaffolds for the killing spree that's about ready to be unleashed against the Jews. So it comes back the second time. And this time, when at the end of the party, when the king asks Esther, what do you ask? What do you need? What do you want? She says, my people are about ready to be destroyed. Now, she doesn't say who her people are. He says, my people are about ready to be destroyed. And the king gets really upset, says, who would do such a thing? And she points at Haman. Now, the king doesn't know what to do. If you read the story real well, he leaves the room where the banquet's being held because he's conflicted. He really likes this guy, but this, if what his wife is saying is true, he can't let this go undone because I guess he loved Esther. He liked Mordecai. And so he comes back in, and when he comes back in the room, he sees something that makes the decision for him. Because while he's out in the garden contemplating what he's going to do, Mordecai is pleading his case. Oh, queen, please, please, forget, we don't know what he said, but he's pleading his case. And she's sitting down, and I don't know, intensity to make his point, he falls on top of Esther so that when the king comes in, here's what he sees. He sees his wife sitting on the couch and Haman on top of her. Immediately, he calls for the guards and have him killed. He issues a new edict because he can't undo the old edict. And the new edict says that when they come to kill you, Jews, defend yourself. Defend yourselves, and we will support you in defending yourselves. We know from history that there were still a number of Jews that were killed. Nothing like would have happened if the edict had not been checked by Esther and what she did, but very few were killed. And in fact, Mordecai gets promoted in the kingdom, and this is what the Jews celebrate. The festival of Purim is the celebration of the Jews defending themselves. Let's kind of wrap up our thoughts here. God uses one person to save his people, Esther. We think of Moses because there's other examples of this. Moses, or some of the judges like Deborah and Gideon, even Samson. One person used by God can make the difference. May we never forget that. We think we've got to be a mighty force, and there's nothing wrong with a mighty force, but sometimes, as Gideon learned, is that when there's few in number, God gets all the glory. When there's a mighty force, God gets lost. One person used by God can make a difference. You can make a difference in your world. I can make a difference in my world. Second, we see this principle throughout the exile and beyond, Now, Esther is part of the story. Her part of the story doesn't last very long, really. She lives we're not sure about, maybe another 10 to 15 years, somewhere in there after the events that take place here. But the fact is that the book really only take up a matter of weeks or months, and then she just disappears. Okay. She had a season where she made a huge contribution. And we see here a woman who was not only beautiful, but she was smart. She was a woman with integrity. She was scared. You would have been scared. I would have been scared. And yet, when she realized what she needed to do, she went and did it in strength. In strength. Hey, that person who she was didn't just arrive. It wasn't a switch that was flipped on. It was nurtured by her parents and later by Mordecai. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, there is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. Okay, one God. And then he says, thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And you are to impress and teach them the commandments and impress them upon your children when you get up in the morning, when you lay down at night, when you're walking along the road. Okay. In other words, we are to find all of those teachable moments when we can share with our grandkids, with our great grandkids, teach them virtues and teach them principles that will shape them for the rest of their lives. Now, what's happening back in Jerusalem? We're going to pick that story up next week because the people are rebuilding. Remember, Solomon's temple is completed. It's been 30 years, but things weren't going like they should. And that's where we're going to pick up the story next week. Esther, what an incredible story. Tremendous woman. And there's two parts of it. One, we tend to gloss over some parts, but think of this. She didn't sign up to join a beauty pageant. It wasn't Miss Universe pageant. She was told, you are coming with me. Imagine what she was feeling like when she was taken from her home and taken to the palace. She probably was filled with all kinds of anxiety and fear. What's going to take place? Hey, we don't know what they told her when they took her to Susa, but when she got there, all of a sudden she's now realizing she's part of something that, wow, this is all right, but going to become the queen? Really? And then when she becomes the queen, okay, then we realize that she now, and I always wonder, because this is true in my life, maybe it's true in your life, is that when we look back, we start seeing God's hand in things. I wonder, years after the events of the book of Esther, because she had a kid with the king. And I wonder if she told that's her son about what happened years earlier. And all of a sudden she began to see. It's interesting, Esther, God's never mentioned once in the book, and yet you see God at work in the entire book. Okay. And that's true in your life and my life. We see, wow, God was there. That was a God moment. I didn't see it as a God moment when it happened, but now that I look back at it, God was there for just the time as this. And that's my prayer as I work with college students and now high school students, is that the season I have, it's not years. For some, I may have 2 years. For some, I may only have 8 or 9 months with them. And that's the only time I ever have, is that during that time, Lord, allow me to invest in them. Allow me to help them grow in the character that honors you, with the love and devotion to you. Help me to see, as I teach them, whether it's Bible or personal finance, that these things, God cares about, because he cares about them, and he wants to be a part of their life, and he wants to take what he's given to them so that they in turn might be a blessing to other people. Father, thank you for Esther. Thank you for Mordecai. Wow. He took his cousin, raised her, and then influenced her, who in turn changed the course of a people that were in diaspora. God, I want to be more like Esther. I want to be, I'm not worried about being beautiful, but I just want to be smart. I want to be a person of integrity. I want to be strong. Your word says, be strong and courageous. Lord, I want to be strong. I want to be courageous to live the life you've called me to live, to impact my world. Keep us all safe now, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you guys. Have a great day. Hopefully we'll see you next week.